Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Horror Corner. I'm your host, Sean Patrick Erschen, and this week we are doing Volume 4 of my horror movie DVD and Blu Ray collection. Now, since we left off on Volume 3, I have amassed quite a few movies since then, and that was quite a while ago, so yeah. Got quite a few since then, and we're going to show them off today and maybe talk a little bit about each one, not too much. So let's get started. And we're going to start with some Hammer horror classics. And this is the ultimate Hammer horror film to me, and that is Horror of Dracula, which to me is the greatest Dracula film of all time. I absolutely love this movie. I cannot get enough of it. I've seen it so many times, and it never gets old. It's just absolutely perfect. Starring, of course, the legendary Christopher Lee in the role of Count Dracula, and Peter Cushing in the role of Dr. Van Helsing. Next is another sequel in the Hammer Dracula franchise, and that is Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. An awesome sequel in the franchise, of course starring Christopher Lee as Count Dracula, and you got Veronica Carson in there, who is a Hammer staple. Just an awesome sequel, and Christopher Lee is just at his malevolent, evil best here. And Veronica Carson does a fantastic job. And this is loaded with awesome gothic visuals, probably the best visuals in the franchise. Next up is this recent release from Scream Factory, Dracula, Prince of Darkness. So this is an excellent release for all you Hammer lovers out there. This is a must-have. And this is, of course, on Blu Ray. Christopher Lee, this was his second outing as the Count. He wasn't able to be in Brides of Dracula. I'm not sure whether he actually turned the role down, but he did return for Prince of Darkness and continued to play the character several more times after that. Now this film, he didn't have any lines in the film, but regardless, this is still a classic horror vampire film in every way. Next up is Lust for a Vampire. This is part 2 in the Karnstein trilogy, which is 3 films based on the Carmilla novel, which actually predated Dracula. And they're all kind of lesbian themed in nature a little bit, and they're all more sexualized, I'd say, than like the classic Hammer vampire films. They add a little bit more flesh, and nudity and sex stuff, but regardless, they're quite good. I think they're still good, solid vampire films. Next up is The Mummy. This is Hammer's version of The Mummy as opposed to the Universal Monsters version. Once again, you have Christopher Lee in the role of the Mummy, and you've got Peter Cushing as well in this film. So, classic Hammer horror in every way. Next up, I have this Hammer Films collection here, which I actually got as a gift from none other than Rusting Willpower. I think it was my last birthday last year. Yeah, she sent me a gift card, and this is what I got. I got a Hammer Films collection, and this actually has the Gorgon on it, which is a really cool Hammer film. With, you guessed it, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing are in this film. And of course it's about the, mythological figure, the Gorgon. Much like Medusa, the old classic tale. Next up we have Scars of Dracula, another entry in the Hammer Dracula franchise, and this is also from Scream Factory. So I'm so glad that Scream Factory is starting to do the Hammer Dracula films, because they're doing a fantastic job so far. And this is kind of one of the lesser known ones, but it's highly underrated. Christopher Lee has a lot more to do in this film. He has a lot more dialogue than some of the others, and I really enjoy it. Unfortunately, it has some very poorly rendered vampire bats, but outside of that, this is just classic Hammer. And this one isn't quite Hammer, but it has Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, and that is Horror Express, also starring Telly Savalas. Next, we're going to get into some of the Italian Jello films, which I have recently started to collect, and I really enjoy them. And here's a classic from Dario Argento, Tenebrae. This is a brutal horror film from Dario Argento, which borders on slasher territory, you know. There's some really vicious, brutal death scenes in this movie, as there are really in all Dario Argento's movies. And here's another Dario Argento classic, Opera. Once again, yes, some very brutal death scenes. I'd say this one is a lot more stylish than probably Tenebrae. This is definitely a classic Italian giallo film in every way, for sure. This is Argento at his best. And you all know this one. This is definitely considered one of Dario Argento's biggest classic horror films, and that is Deep Red. Once again, this is an Italian giallo film, done right, done the way it needs to be done, the way it's supposed to be done, in every way. Brutal death scenes, and you got the classic leather-gloved killer, you know. And it's got amazing style, amazing direction by Dario Argento, amazing camera work. Visually, it's just stunning. And last but certainly not least is this awesome edition of Suspiria. Unbelievable film. To me, this is the masterpiece from Dario Argento. Just an absolute classic, and this is from Synapse Films, this release, which is just absolutely loaded with special features. Just a fantastic edition. I love that cover work there. That cover art is just amazing. Next up, we have another one that kind of walks the fine line between Italian giallo and slasher movie. Because there's some serious slashing going on in this. This is, of course, directed by the legendary Lucio Fulci, the New York Ripper, which is just infamous for its graphic blood and gore and overall sleaziness. Yeah, definitely highly recommend this film if you love slasher movies and if you love Italian giallo films, because this is the best of both worlds. Okay, guys, now we're going to get into the slasher films, and basically random slasher sequels. Okay, this is a one-shot deal here. This is Happy Birthday to Me. All you horror slasher movie lovers definitely know this film. Of course, you had Melissa Sue Anderson from Little House on the Prairie starring in this film, and she does a great job, and this is just a fantastic slasher movie. And this is a really cool Blu Ray release from Indicator. Just awesome. Just a classic slasher movie. I feel like this movie had a lot more plot than most slasher movies do. It's actually pretty complex, and I love it. It's amazing. Next up, we have the newest Halloween film, and that is simply Halloween, which saw the return of Michael Myers after, like, at least, 10 years of silence? And he came back in a huge way in 2018 with this film, directed by David Gordon Green, and starring the return of Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode. Next up, we have Scream 4, which I recently picked this up. I do think Scream 4 was basically a nice return to form, and you had the final direction of this film by Wes Craven. So this was his last entry in the film. I heard there is going to be a Scream 5, so that would be obviously a new director taking over the franchise. So we'll see what happens with that. I don't know if they're going to bring back the original cast or if they're just going to start a whole new generation. Next up, we have Final Destination 2, which is a lot of people's favorite of the franchise. It's definitely got some of the best death scenes in the franchise history, especially that opening scene with the car accident. It's just insane. I really enjoy the Final Destination series, and I'd probably have to say, well, I'm not sure. I'm torn between this and the original. Next up is kind of the black sheep of the Friday 13th franchise, and that is Friday 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, which at the time pissed off a lot of the Friday 13th fans because it didn't actually, spoiler alert, have Jason as the killer. So yeah, they kind of went in a slightly different direction, even though technically it's like the standard slice and dice of Friday the 13th. I mean, there's nothing too out of the ordinary. But I would say this film has more humor than a lot of the others, and it's a lot more gratuitous nudity than the others, so this is a real fun time. I've really grown to love this movie over the years. It's a lot of fun. Next up is the original classic, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, I did show this film in one of my previous videos, but this is the updated Blu Ray release. I just had a plain old DVD on that. So, yeah, this is a nice 4K restoration Blu Ray, and it's just looks great. It sounds great. And yeah, I was definitely in need of an upgrade, because this is one of the greatest horror films of all time, and you need to have a decent edition of it. Next up, yeah, we're getting into the random sequels here. This is Child's Play 2, which many people consider to be the best in the franchise. A lot of people say that Child's Play 2 is their favorite in the Child's Play franchise. It's hard to argue. Me personally, I prefer the original, but this one is definitely more action, more entertaining, and more fun. And then you have Child's Play 3, which a lot of people don't like this one as much as the others. This is one of the least popular of the franchise, I would say. But I find it to be a lot of fun. You know, I still think it's great. I think it's a really good time. But yeah, I don't consider it as good as the first two, but it's certainly a worthy sequel to me. Next up, we have Sleepaway Camp 2, Unhappy Campers. Such an underrated sequel. I find this movie to be an absolute blast. Granted, you had Pamela Springsteen taking over the role of Angela Baker from Felissa Rose, but I think she does an amazing job, actually, and she makes this role her own. She plays this role differently than Felissa Rose did. This is a more comical version, kind of, of Angela, whereas the first film was a little bit more serious in tone. Even though it did have a lot of humor, at the end of the day, it was still a slasher film, you know. It was still a horror movie, where Sleepaway Camp 2, I'd say, is more almost like a parody. It certainly has the brutal kills and all that, but it's got a lot more humor. It's a lot more meta, kind of, you know, like Scream was. There's a lot more parody elements, and man, Pamela Springsteen is just amazing in this film. I love her performance. Next up is A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. I actually really do enjoy this one. I know a lot of people don't. They feel like this is where the series started going downhill. I don't really think so. I think this still was very solid, you know. There's a lot of really cool dream sequences in this movie, and I feel Freddy was still scary, even though he did start giving a lot more one-liners in this movie, and there was a lot more tongue-in-cheek humor, and they certainly continued in that direction. Which brings me to A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child. Now, to me, this is where they really went off the rails, you know. This is where they lost me with Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child. I'm not really a big fan of this movie at all. Yeah, way too much humor in this film, and I feel like it started off promising at the beginning, but yeah, it's just way too over the top and way too comical for its own good. Next up is Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Now, I hate this movie. I don't know what to say, you know, I just can't stand it, you know, it's just too ridiculous, it's too over the top, it's just terrible, I just can't stand it. To me, this is the straw that broke the camel's back for the Elm Street franchise. And I think all the viewers can agree with that, pretty much. Most people do not like this film. Which, thank goodness, they did come back and try to rectify that with this film. You had Wes Craven himself, the man returning to the franchise to direct the final film in the Elm Street franchise, and that is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Yeah, we don't talk about the remake, okay? This is the last film in the Elm Street franchise, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. While I do have my issues with this film, I feel the pacing is very slow and lacking in tension. I feel it definitely drags at some points, you know. But they did succeed in making Freddy scary again and not just being like a caricature of himself, you know. He's a lot closer to the way he was originally intended in the first couple films, you know. He's definitely more demonic and scary, and that's what they succeeded in this film. And I also love the concept of it. I feel they handled that concept better in the Scream franchise, but it was cool to see that idea play out in this film. And overall, I enjoyed it. It's not one of my favorites, but I did like the direction of Wes Craven. It was cool to see him come back to his baby and kind of rejuvenate the franchise a little bit. Yeah. Alright guys, so that's it for Volume 4 of my horror movie DVD and Blu Ray collection. Thank you for joining me, Sean Patrick Erschen, in the Horror Corner. Tune in and stay scared.